Hi everyone. Today I'm here with Matjaž Macuh. He is a nutritionist and we're gonna talk about all things related to nutrition, especially for athletes and triathletes. Hello Matjaž, welcome to the podcast. I would first like to start by you telling the listeners a bit more about yourself.
Hello, Klemen. So first of all, thank you so much for bringing me on the podcast. It's a real pleasure. I have a master's degree in applied sports nutrition from St. Mary's University in Twickenham, London. I am currently pursuing my PhD in the field of nutrition, specifically sports nutrition, even more specifically around nitrates and how they impact sport performance. So I am, on the one hand, actively involved in the research process, so figuring out how to improve athletes' performance whilst best suiting their lifestyle, their needs, taking into account practical implications and things like that. And on the other hand, I'm working as a sports nutritionist here in Slovenia under the company named Feel Good. I work with a lot of different athletes from different sports. So endurance athletes, we have track and field athletes, soccer players, basketball, football, etc., etc. I work from anywhere from recreational athletes, also younger age, to older athletes, recreational or competing at the highest level. Some of them are Olympic norm athletes, have been competing at the Olympics at least once, representing Slovenia, perhaps even twice. So that's a little background around me. Now I think we can dive into the questions at hand.
That's very nice, yes. So you have both practical experience and a lot of theoretical knowledge about nutrition and sports, which is always a good combination. And if we come to the topic of nutrition, nutrition is sometimes called the fourth discipline of triathlon because it's very important, especially in longer distance triathlons. Maybe start by explaining why nutrition is actually so important for athletes and triathletes in general.
Why is nutrition so important for triathletes, especially, and why we call it the fourth discipline? We can look at that question from a few different perspectives. I guess the first one would be from an adaptation standpoint. So what we're doing, let's say when we're running or cycling or when we're at the pool. So when we're exercising in general, training, that's just a stimuli, right? But what our body does with that stimuli is highly dependent upon every other factor that is not training. Especially how we recover, so how we sleep, how we manage stress, how we manage fatigue, and in a large amount, also how we manage our nutrition. So we can have a huge stimuli from a great training session, but what our body does with that will be dependent upon our nutrition. How well we adapt to that stimuli is highly dependent upon our nutrition. The second one, apart from the adaptation process, is the exercise in itself. You know, you can have $1 million car, right? A huge VO2 max, very strong lung capacity, etc. But if your fuel engine is low, well, then your car isn't going anywhere. So how you fuel will highly impact on how you perform and how you, in turn, adapt. So a lot of times we talk about the high carb concept in endurance. And yes, one of the things that is important is from a standpoint of performing right here, right now at this very training session. So this is what I'm talking about at the moment. But the second one would be how I am training through a larger or mesocycle, meaning through a longer period of time, right? And how well of a stimuli I'm giving my body throughout that. So the exercise standpoint, the adaptation standpoint, and the next few key things that nutrition brings to the table is obviously injury prevention might be a stretch because you can do everything perfectly and still get injured because training is a stress in itself. But certainly managing injuries, having a lower likelihood of getting injured, or if you do get injured in the process, getting back faster to training and healing those injuries does occur if nutrition is in place. And from a immune function perspective. So training in itself, like I said, is a stressor. it can be a good stressor if we manage it correctly, but it can also be a bad one. And our immune function is highly dependent upon our nutrition, how we fuel, how many calories we give our body, how we periodize carbohydrates throughout the day, how much protein we eat throughout the day, etc. So immune function, injury prevention, adaptation, and especially exercise performance in the acute and the long term. And I almost forgot, obviously, there is another important factor to take into consideration. It's gut training, right? Triathlon and Ironman, these are endurance and ultra-endurance events. They take a long time. And as much as you can train your muscles, you can also train your gut. The adaptations happen in a different way, in a different pathway, but they do happen. And when we get to competition, you have to not only be trained muscle-wise, you also have to be trained gut-wise. So how much your body can process food when you're training, when you're exercising, when you're competing, how much calories can we uptake, how well we use it, etc. And not get sick in the process or have muscle cramps and things like that. So that's also something that comes into effect during our training sessions. And not necessarily competing, right? Because if you're testing out like higher carb protocols before and during competition for the first time, instead of doing that in your training sessions beforehand, well, then you're risking a lot, right? That's not the way to do things. So gut training is also something that's really important and is in the domain of nutrition for triathletes.
That's a very good and very specific answer. Thank you very much for that. And I would like to go a bit further now, because especially nowadays it seems that we can read all sorts of news and articles about nutrition online, and we hear about all these diets and everything. And I understand that people are often confused. They don't know what to believe, what to follow. So if we could just stay at the simplest point possible, what would you say? How should a normal or a regular nutrition for an endurance athlete look like?
So how should regular nutrition for an endurance athlete look like? Well, first of all, we have to start with the basics. Anytime I'm working with an athlete one-on-one, or if we're working with smaller groups, we start off with building a structure, a fundamental structure around easy days or rest days. And that would be around the 3 main meals. So breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And a basic structure means we have to have a basic timetable around them, when we eat them, and how they look. They should contain a higher quality protein source to have like protein consistency throughout the day. This is very important not only for muscle recovery, but also for recovery of tendons, ligaments, for immune function, for gut health, and things like that, okay? Also, with the protein source, we start there, then we add some fruits and veggies. Fruits and veggies are, a very a good source of different nutrients, vitamins, minerals, fiber, etc. So nutrients that we find in, let's say, lesser amounts or in lesser bioavailability types in the higher protein sources. And also vice versa is true. So pairing a protein source with some fruit and some veggies, either or, right, is a very good starting point for each one of these main meals. Now, the second part is fueling, right? So we have the basic structure. We have taken care of the nutrients that our body needs to survive, to function well, to have good recovery, right? But now we need to fuel. And fueling will be dependent upon how active we are. Meaning we need to have more or less carbohydrates depending upon the day we're at. If it's a rest day, we need less carbohydrates, and if we're training a lot, if we're doing 2 a days, we need to fuel copious amounts of carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are here for a reason. They are the main energy source during higher intensity work, when we demand our body to give us higher outputs. We need to fuel it well. If you're driving your car a lot, you need to fuel it more. And vice versa, if it's staying in the garage a whole lot of time, well, then it doesn't need a whole lot of fuel, right? Mainly when we're talking about, let's say, recreational triathletes, we start off by at least having, some unprocessed carbohydrates, at least in the main meals. We're talking about oats and pasta and rice and things like that. But everything else that comes around that is more or less a higher amount of processed carbohydrates. So carbohydrates that have less fiber are easily digestible. They don't sit in your stomach too long. They don't make you, cramp in your stomach, have those hard feelings and things like that. Why? Well, because fueling is our number one priority. The number one factor that makes a nutrition of somebody healthy or not is dependent upon if we're eating enough calories. If you're not eating enough calories, independent of what those calories are, if they're, everything is unprocessed, a lot of veggies and fruit and good quality protein sources, if you're not fueling well, you cannot eat healthy because you will start to lose weight. Your immune function will drop. There will be a higher likelihood of injuries happening. Your performance will drop drastically. In women, we see a drop in amenorrhea, so the loss of the menstrual cycle. In men, we see low testosterone levels, low libido. Your sleep goes to the can, and things like that. So how we fuel around that, how we manage that will be highly dependent upon how active the individual is and at what level he or she is performing, right? But we need to have that basic structure first before we start putting on carbohydrates on top of that. However, protein, fats, veggies, things like that, at least in recreational triathletes, we keep them more or less the same, independent of the day. And then we just structure carbohydrates in more or less processed amounts, again, dependent upon the activity level of the individual.
Yes, very well said. And you also answered a couple of questions that I had planned for the next part of our talk. But if we go now from the general to specifics, how should an athlete structure their meal before a workout, after the workout, and then how should they fuel, if they should fuel at all during the workout?
An extremely important consideration here is obviously peri-workout nutrition. So these would account to the considerations of nutrition around our workouts. Peri-workout nutrition means our nutrition before, during, and after training sessions. Before training sessions, we need to be mindful of a couple of things. We try to keep our fats low and our fiber low. Why? Both fats and fiber will impact digestibility in a quite high manner. So carbohydrates will be less available in our bloodstream to use as fuel on the one hand. On the other hand, food will sit in our bodies. We'll have that bad feeling in our stomachs during workouts and things like that. So before a training session, try to minimize fats and try to minimize fiber that we would find in like veggies or legumes or higher fiber carbohydrates. So moving from, let's say, classic pasta to more white pasta, or from brown rice to white rice, or from brown bread to white bread, you get the thing. If it would be like breakfast foods, then I would rather see milk rice or grace is like a food here in Slovenia that we use a lot of times with endurance athletes instead of oats. Oats are great, but they have a ton of fiber, so we move from that to like lesser fiber cereals and things like that. So that would be like the main consideration before a workout. Also fueling enough before a workout, having at least those 1 to 4 grams of carbohydrates per kilogram of body weight. That would be essential. Now during workouts, we also fuel, right? We fuel dependent upon how long the training session is and how intense it is. If it's not as intense and it's around 1 hour or less in length, then adding additional fuel during a workout is definitely not necessary. But if it's longer than that, then yes, obviously you have to start adding carbohydrates. We're talking about faster absorbing, more easily digestible carbohydrates, which usually come in the form of isotonic drinks or gels and things of that nature. So things that our body can use really quickly as fuel and does not sit in our stomach. As far as the nutrition right after a workout, we usually consider the 3 R's. So refuel, repair, and rehydrate. Refuel would mean refuel with carbohydrates. This would be more important if we're experiencing another bout of training the same day, or if we have another hard training session planned the next day, or if we're in like competition and things like that. That becomes extremely important. You have to have a lot of easily digestible carbohydrates as fast as possible. If that's not the case, you can take your time with the carbohydrates. You can eat more or less processed carbohydrates instead of drinking them and things like that. As far as the other R, so repair, we're talking about protein. Having around 20 to 40 grams of higher quality protein quite close to finishing a training session is a good proper consideration. It's good for, well, as the name suggests, repairing. And as I said before, not only our muscles. Usually we get the feeling that protein is, only for muscles, only for bodybuilders, for fitness and things like that. No. It's for a lot of other things as well. So I mentioned, ligaments, soft tissue, everything that needs repair, especially more when we're running a lot and things like that, our gut, our immune function and things like that. So endurance athletes need a lot of protein as well. You might even make the case that they need a little bit more of protein than athletes who are not endurance based. But that's, let's say, a debate for another time. And then obviously rehydrate. When we're talking about rehydrate, we mean water specifically, but also water with electrolytes in certain cases, especially if we're sweating a lot, if we're losing a lot of sodium, if it's hot outside and things like that. So refuel, carbohydrates, repair, protein, rehydrate, water especially, but also electrolytes have to be considered here.
You explained that very well, and this gives me another question to ask you. I think that when it comes to fueling during the workouts, we have kind of like two camps. There's one side that focuses a lot of fueling, maybe even more than necessary. Then on the other side, we have a camp that says that you shouldn't fuel at all, that if you're doing low intensity workouts, your body is gonna use the fats you have stored in your body anyways, that just drinking water is enough. And you see people going on 2-3 hour training sessions and not fueling. And I want you to explain a bit more about this mistake. So not what happens if you don't fuel enough during the workout, and maybe explain some other mistakes athletes might make during their training.
What would be the biggest mistakes that athletes make? Well, one classical one would be trying something new on race day. Trying a brand new gel that your friend recommended right at the start line. Don't do that. When you get to the start line, everything has to be rehearsed prior to that during your training sessions, right? The competition in itself is a huge stressor. It affects your gut directly because a lot of blood is being directed to your extremities, to your legs and arms when you're working. So the gut isn't working as properly as it should. And also there's the mental side of things that can impact your gut as well. Don't try anything new, right? Just give that gel a go some other time, or that new supplement a go some other time. The second one would be chronic underfueling. This is something that we see in elite athletes, especially elite endurance athletes, not fueling enough, perhaps because of reasons that are, in the nature of having too clean of a diet, or just not being able to eat as much food as our body demands because the energy requirements are so big. But yeah, chronic underfueling is a big one. It happens in elite sports a lot, and it can lead to REDS, so relative energy deficiency syndrome, and the problems that I've mentioned earlier in terms of chronic fatigue, decreased performance, higher injury likelihood, loss of the menstrual cycle, lower testosterone levels, and things like that. What would be another one? I guess overestimating sweat or underestimating salt. So let's say drinking only liquid water without electrolytes during longer endurance sessions. Going for that 4 or 5 hour bike ride and just going on water, right? That's not good. Okay, that in certain cases that can be even lead to very, very hard, complicated health issues. So don't do that, right? Drinking too much plain water without electrolytes, especially if it's hotter outside. Summer is just around the corner here in Slovenia, so use isotonic drinks and help yourselves with gels with electrolytes and things like that. I guess those would be like the main ones that I usually see in endurance sports, but I'm sure there's a lot more cases that can be made, like improper supplement use or using supplements that whilst not even having like a basic understanding of how much protein and carbohydrates I need. So if I would have like a hierarchy of our needs in nutrition, then covering my energy needs as well as macro and micronutrient needs would be right at the top, and right at the very bottom of this hierarchy would be supplements. And a lot of the times, especially when you're working with younger athletes, this pyramid can be backwards. That would be a typical one as well.
Okay, you also explained this very well. At the beginning, you said a couple of things about injuries and illnesses, and right now you explained that these are also consequences of improper nutrition, and you mentioned other consequences, so being low on energy and such. Now, if somebody listening to this podcast is thinking, that sounds a lot like me, how should this person start, let's say, fueling properly or start addressing this issue of improper nutrition?
So how should beginners start to plan their food? Well, first of all, at the beginning, it's about understanding the basics, like always, right? It's like buying a new house or building a new house, right? You can't talk about what type of towels and drapes you're going to have in your kitchen or whatever without even, having the basic structure of the house being built. Don't get me wrong, having nice towels in the kitchen is cool and it's important, I guess. But it's not as important as building a good foundation, right? And that good foundation in nutrition is understanding your energy needs first, right? So just having a basic understanding of what high quality protein sources are, carbohydrate sources, and fat sources, and how much of these foods do I need in my diet, and how to cover these needs without having to weigh everything down, without having to count every calorie and things like that. That is extremely important. Now, don't get me wrong, calorie counting can work. It obviously works. For some people, it works great, but for some people, it just means, they become too food focused, right? And everything starts to revolve around food. And when you're working with young athletes, especially, that can lead down a pathway that you don't want, right? Meaning they start to have issues with their self-esteem and things like that. So just getting a basic grasp of, what's protein, what's carbs, what's fat, excuse me, how much do you need it on a daily basis and things like that, this is where you should start. When you get that understanding, then, build the foundation around your rest days or your easy days. When you have that, then start building layers on top of that, meaning adding more carbohydrates, especially more and more if you're training more, if you're doing 2 a days, if you're competing and things like that. And then taking care of your peri-workout nutrition, as we talked about before. So thinking about my nutrition right before a training session, lower fiber, lower fat, thinking about my nutrition during an activity, so not necessarily necessary if it's an easier and shorter duration, less than 1 hour, but more than 1 hour. We're talking about carbohydrate intakes of at least 30 to 50 grams of carbohydrates per hour, and obviously a lot more if you're competing at the highest level. Helping yourself with gels, isotonics, and things like that. And then right after your training session, especially if it's a harder training session, thinking about the 3 R's, right? So refueling, repairing, and rehydrating as fast as possible, especially if you have another training bout, or if you have a competition, or if you have a harder training bout the next day, right? When you get those basics down, right? When you're good at the basics, okay, then you have bought yourself the opportunity to talk about other things, about the drapes and the towels, meaning the supplements, right? But I guess that's a discussion for another time. The next thing, even if you are a beginner, think about training the gut, okay? Because training the gut is something that's extremely important, not only for competing, but also for training in general. And it takes a long time to happen. These adaptations do not happen as fast as muscle adaptations do. So start incorporating some fuel, carbohydrates, and also some fluids into your training sessions. See how you feel. Start at the lower end, let's say around 30 grams of carbohydrates, mixed carbohydrates, so glucose, fructose per hour, and then start adding on top of that. And see how you feel, and that brings me to the next point. Keep a log. Don't just be a bystander of your nutrition. Be actively involved in it. Keeping a log of what foods feel better for you before a training, how many carbs were good at this intensity, and things like that. Those are all data points, right? And as much data points as you can gather them, right? Because you can put everything into praxis after that, into competition, and you will get the best possible result. So start with the basics. Don't start with the fanciest supplement. Start with the basics. When you're good at that, add the supplements, whatever. Train the gut and start doing that as fast as possible, right? keep a log. So be active in your nutrition. Don't just be a bystander. Those would be my main points for everyone when they start to think about their nutrition.
That's very well said. I think that this is such a great point to end on. So I would like to thank you once again for talking with me. Of course, you mentioned a lot about your work. So if somebody is interested in maybe contacting you, asking you questions, working with you, can you maybe tell the listeners where they can find you?
Thank you so much again, Klemen, for inviting me on the podcast. I hope this was useful. I hope we see each other again soon, perhaps talking about another topic. Supplements might be an interesting one. As far as where people can find me, Instagram and my email, I guess, would be the most prominent sources of how to get in touch with me. And I'm sure you can leave that information in the show notes. So thank you again, and hopefully see you soon.
Yeah, that's a perfect suggestion. I'm gonna leave the Instagram and the email in the show notes, like you said, and people are gonna have no trouble finding you. But yeah, like I said, thank you very much. I hope that listeners are gonna enjoy this podcast because it has a lot of valuable knowledge. And I think that we should talk more often, especially like we said about supplements, and maybe even answer some listener questions if we get them. Yeah, it was nice talking to you, and I wish you all the best.